So my name is Michael Watson. I'm from Apollo. I'm a solutions architect. I recently gave a talk just last year at GraphQL Summit, the do's and don'ts for your schemas and operations. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to actually follow it up and really show more of the how-to, right? So if you didn't get a chance to see my talk, it's on YouTube. Go ahead and revisit that. But today we're really going to dive kind of into it. So this was kind of the summation slide from my previous presentation of what are the things we should be thinking about. And I think one of the big things that my talk really surrounded was how to start thinking about what should we do with our schema and what should we do with our operations. Because a lot of times the way our projects start building out and growing, we don't really think about that until it's too late, right? And what I always like to think of is everybody has kind of that champion that brings GraphQL inside the organization. This is a great opportunity for you to take like reign of some of these things and help get a promotion. Because I always think that GraphQL is an opportunity for all the developers to get promoted internally and really start to bring in just a better way to do things. So let's talk about each one of these things, right? So for our schema best practices, for those of you who haven't seen my previous talk, I think one of the important things we want to start doing is having a schema that represents our product and really what our clients want to be consuming as data. So the first bullet point is about creating a user entry point. And that's commonly referred to as a me endpoint. So here's like an example of that schema. This is a federated schema, but it's the same for an individual schema. You want to have an entry point for, as an authenticated logged in user, what are the things that I can start doing as a logged in user, right? Our schema is really our product. This is our opportunity to think about how do we want our product and how do we want that user experience to be? Because a lot of time we're trying to have the same experience driven across our website, our mobile app, our iOS app, our IoT devices, whatever it may be. And by creating a schema that really represents our product, we're enabling that on an omni-channel strategy. So evolving your graph based on client needs, right? I don't really have a great example for this because it's kind of use case dependent, but as you're changing your graph should be changing driven by what the clients need to actually deliver the data and show whatever UI experience they're delivering, right? You don't want to just like add data onto the graph if you don't really have a use case for it. You know, you just kind of heard in the previous talk about how they were able to understand field level usage. And from that field level usage, they were able to determine how do you deprecate fields and kind of evolve your graph, right? And so that's where you want to evolve that graph based on that data. How is your graph being used? Now, provide a schema that doesn't cause consumers to manipulate data. I actually have a pretty good example for this, and I want to dive into this because I think this is one of the really powerful, important things in GraphQL. So I had all these things, so I have to like copy and paste it. But I want to give an example using GitHub's Explore, since it's a readily available, oh, I didn't put the variables in. So using GitHub's graphical right here, one thing I want to talk about is when we're talking about delivering the data that our clients need, one of the things that I always recommend is putting filtering criteria on your graph, right? A lot of times when you're thinking about selecting between different options in a list, you know, we've all created lists, we've all had filters on that. If that's criteria that's already on our graph, so meaning that first query is already returning the actual data you need, you can start using state management and your actual local cache to make this a much better experience. So you can even see on GitHub's API, that's exactly what they're doing, right? So they actually have a sort by. This is for GitHub issues. And I have, you know, created at, updated at, and comments that I can sort by. That's the behavior they want to drive on their product and the API experience they're delivering. So let's take a closer look at that. This is actually a little client application using Apollo Client 3. It's just reaching out to that GitHub API. And here's that list I was talking about, right? It's just a list of GitHub issues associated with a repo. And I can sort it by my various options, right? And this experience is really nice. And the nice thing about this is since we're putting the filtering criteria on our graph, the mobile applications can start taking advantage of this. Everyone can start taking advantage of this. And it really drives what a product owner might want to deliver on that graph experience. And let's take a look at the code real quick, just to get really deep into that, right? So we have that same query that we were running right inside of here. And one of the nice things is we can actually just get our state or use our state for that sorting option inside of here. And we can now just map that simple data structure into what we want to display out, just like what we'd expect, right? There's no more business logic on the client of actually filtering that list or sorting things, taking anything out. This isn't the simplest example, but you can probably look at a lot of instances. I know there's been discussions about things like, how should we format dates? Should we add another field with a new date format? Should we give options to developers to format that date, right? What's the experience you're trying to drive on that graph? And really put that out there and then evolve your graph based on those decisions and the data behind it. So I saw a lot of people doing GraphQL and stuff. How many people are in production with GraphQL? Okay, about half the room. How many people are in production with GraphQL and they got introspection on? Oh, great. So we got one. Public API usage? Oh. Documentation for internal usage? Yep. Gotcha. So dynamic fields on your graph. So one of the things we typically recommend is having introspection turned off in production unless you have a use case or something driven behind it. Sometimes that's a public API, sometimes that's how you're actually delivering out your graph. One of the things that I think about, and a lot of teams as they start building up their graph, they get to this point where their schema is too big, they got too many types, they want to break it down into the various teams, right? And you want to start getting to this point where now you have dispersed teams all contributing to this one graph. Well, one thing that becomes very challenging in that is when you rely on your tooling off of introspection, you now have the challenge of, is that graph up, right? Is this piece of the puzzle ready for me to compose my entire graph? And there becomes a lot of different deployment options that you have to start building into your strategy. So one of the things we recommend is using a centralized schema registry. So like one of the things we have at Apollo is our central schema registry. Let me make this a little bigger so we can see. So we have an open source Apollo CLI. It's Apollo tooling in our repo. And this is one of the ways where you can interact with our schema registry. And one thing, if you notice, if you look at the Apollo tooling repo, it's actually built on a language server. And that language server is just making mutations and queries to our graph, right? So you can even see how, when I'm talking about your product experience, that's meaning also our CLI in our example, right? So thinking about that client and how it might be across your strategies. I'm just leaving my key up here for a long time, right? But Apollo Service Push, this is how we're actually able to take a schema and push it into our registry. So we also have some cloud services. That's what this schema registry is a part. It's available on the community tier. My main point is that everyone at some point is going to start needing some central place for their schema and for everyone to point at. This is a great tool that's out there that's free. And if you have something like federation, there's also managed federation. So if you're pushing pieces of a federated graph into the registry, we create configurations for your gateway to dynamically update based off that. It's all on the community edition, so I'm not trying to sell you anything. All right, so that wraps up for our schema best practices. So let's get to my favorite part, the operations best practices, because I think operations is one of those things we kind of tend to forget about until like there's more than just one team consuming the graph, right? We all of a sudden start seeing these other teams consuming the graph. At Apollo, that was me. So I started out as Apollo in customer success, started working with a bunch of our customers, and I thought, I got all this graph of all this data. I want to like make sure my customers are successful. Like, why don't I, like, what are they doing? What's going on? And then all of a sudden we introduce client identity as a feature in Apollo, right? How do we identify what clients are consuming our graph? And then everyone said, wait, what's this? And that's how they found out me. And I had written just a script just to, you know, pull some things from the graph and query some data. But the important thing in there is really starting to understand who's consuming our graph and how. So the first thing, and if you don't have this already, I mentioned about being like a champion, going and getting promoted, having a standard for your naming convention for your operations. So how many people actually know their company has a standard for like, I'm gonna write a new query component and I'm gonna follow like this type of format for my operations? One, right? So everyone in this room can create that standard. So let me tell you how we do it, and some other options are out there. So some patterns. One thing that's really common, depending on what your team is, what your graph, what you're trying to do, some teams simply just say like what UI paradigm it's coming from, or maybe web or iOS. If we looked at like our Asefi fake org as our demo application, we do that internally for ourselves. We only have an iOS web and Android application in this example. So that's what we decided. The important thing in here though is picking a standard, putting it out there, and having everyone adhere to it. Some other options I've seen out there, I've seen some teams that like maybe they have a mono repo and they have their schema broken out into different folders with like type depths resolvers. They might actually prefix the operations they're putting inside of their project based on that. A few different options, but just put a standard out there. Now, validating your GraphQL operations before shipping anything to production. I mentioned that we have that schema registry in Apollo. One of the benefits of having that as well is there's also an Apollo client check command, which basically extracts out all your query operations and validates them against that schema. It's just a static analysis. The main point is when your client is actually pushing any updates into production, you want to have some test in place that's going to validate that that shape of operation is valid against the shape of the schema that's in production, right? So if you're using the registry, there's a simple command about that. And just to show, actually I don't have that project in here actually. But just to show what that command looks like, there's the Apollo client check. There's a few options in there if you wanted to point at a local endpoint that has introspection available, right? That's a very common pattern in development and everything. And there's a few different things. Maybe you have to pass headers around options. If what you need's not there, send me something on GitHub or email Watson at Apollo GraphQL and I'll help you out. Now, one of the things I think about that's really important is enforcement in our graph. How many people have some tests, or maybe you have some linting rules, or you've built something custom to kind of enforce some structure inside of your graph? Some here or there, some are like, maybe we have, maybe we haven't, we don't know. The important thing I think about when we're talking about who's using our graph, we want to make sure that we can understand not only the client name, but the client version. So I'm sure a lot of people in here are using Apollo Client or have done some project with Apollo Client. One of the things we have in Apollo Client is actually being able to provide a name and version inside of the Apollo Client constructor. All that does is every single request Apollo Client's going to make, it's going to add two known header values, Apollo GraphQL / Apollo Client / name and version. And that's just going to have those two header values on every request. Apollo server will look for those two header values and attach that to every trace operation. And this is how we're essentially adding client identity to every operation that's coming out of our GraphQL server. So this is saying if you're using Apollo Client right now, you actually have those header values of client information that you could be using in your stack today. Add that to your observability and be able to see that. And the big thing about the version is your operations are going to evolve over time. And when you think about of evolution of your operations. One slide that I had from my summit talk, I think sums this up really well. There we go. So it's kind of hard to see with this. Maybe I'll just present just this one slide. Basically, there's two queries on the screen. The top screen is from our 2.18 version of our Apollo CLI, and the bottom screen is our 2.20 Apollo CLI. I bet the performance of those two queries are very, very different. And we need to be able to see that in our observability stack, right? So that means when we're looking at things like metrics for maybe something that's going on inside of our production GraphQL server, we should be able to start breaking that down by what version of our clients and really start slicing the data of that graph, right? So this is what I mean when we're talking about understanding who's using our graph and how. And at a minimum level, we need people to name their operations, right? Have some standard there. And we just need them to identify themselves. So for example, if we're gonna break something or make a breaking change, we know what team to go reach out to and say, hey, notice you're using these fields. For example, being able to see at a field level which clients with which operations are using that. So that way, when we do something like a deprecation, I don't have any deprecation in my production schema to show, but when we do have a deprecation field, we can see how that's being used, right? And that's just important data to drive the evolution of our graph. Now, I mentioned enforcement is really important here. So a lot of times you might think like, how do we make sure that everyone's naming our operations and the clients? Do we go to every client team and tell them? Well, yeah, you got to tell everyone, but you can also put something inside your server that stops them. So one thing that's maybe less commonly known inside of Apollo server is we have a request pipeline API. And you can actually build plugins to tap into the lifecycle events of every operation. And so let's talk about that a little bit more. So on the screen, I've actually have a plugin that I've written. This is something that is specific to Apollo server. So if you're running a Java GraphQL server or something else, the idea is the same, but I don't have a plugin or something nice like this to give you. But if you're using Apollo server, you can use this plugin. And the idea behind here is as the request starts, we can pull out those known client headers. Remember I said it was that Apollo GraphQL -client-name. I wrote it in a way where you can change it if you want, but I'd like it if you kept Apollo in there if you're using Apollo client, right? That was my attempt at a joke. Wasn't that good, but it's okay. We'll move on. You notice that we have the requested start inside the Apollo server plugin. We also have a server will start, right? So you might have some code that you want to run every time the server starts up. Could be for whatever reason you have. And then we have a full lifecycle event inside every request, right? So did encounter errors, all this stuff. And there's always room for improvement inside of our docs and everything, but I think our plugins docs has started to come along really nicely. And I just got a shout out because he's here. I love this graph that shows the life cycle events. Steven, if anyone has any ideas about docs, please talk to Steven right there. He's our docs lead. He made this diagram for me. I was like, yo, we should put this in. It's great. But I think the important thing here is having more understanding of like the life cycle of events that's going on inside your GraphQL server and being able to put controls in place, right? I want to be able to have a GraphQL server where, if no one names it, in my example, I have to at least put a letter in there. But for example, if someone doesn't name their client, we should be saying that, right? If we want to enforce those rules, we want to make sure every client's naming and putting a version on, put it out there to all your teams and just say, hey, on this date, we're going to do that. And if you didn't, sorry. So that's one option. And I think the bigger thing I'd leave behind inside that plugin is you can do a lot more than just what I'm showing right here, right? Maybe you need to report out specific errors. Maybe you need to do something else inside there. Maybe you want to pull some specific data or you have some marketing person, data scientist, whatever, asking you for something. There's a whole lifecycle events and options in here for you to really start controlling that. And I think that's really powerful. And I have that on GitHub. I'm going to release kind of like a little GitHub that has everything with this code up there. I should have done that before this talk, now that I think about that, and have that up. And one last thing I wanted to just kind of talk about, I think one thing that's really important inside of our community is everyone that's here right now, right? It's like a Wednesday and you're all here at 7. I'm sure you have families or other things you could be doing, but we're all here because we want to learn more and we want to understand more. And I think it's a really good opportunity for us to, turn the person next to you, turn the person across the room. You may not know them. Start up a conversation and ask them, what are you doing with GraphQL? And I'm sure there's a lot of similarities, a lot of maybe same pain points. Maybe there's some solutions that someone else could help you with, or if you want, come talk to me. And I'd love to talk GraphQL and help out. But I think the bigger thing is the community. We're kind of some of the people that have started that community and we all want it to grow. So turn and talk to your neighbors. And one of the things, last but not least, Apollo's growing a ton, right? You may not know this, but Apollo's everywhere. But on all serious, Apollo has been kind of at this stage with Apollo Federation, Apollo Client 3. There's a lot of really awesome, great things coming out. And we are actually gonna be doing a lot of expanding this year. So my recruiting team wanted me to throw this up there. And I would love to work with everyone on more GraphQL stuff and help build all this out and build a better community. So with that said, I'd love to answer any questions anyone might have had about my talk. Ooh, good question. When will Apollo Client 3 officially be released? So I've talked with the team about this. The main thing with Apollo Client 3 right now is we want to ensure that the developer experience behind Apollo Client 3 is at the level or better than Apollo Client Stable where it's at right now. To give a little background on Apollo Client 3 for everyone, Apollo Client 3 has a ton of work that has gone into it. And actually, if you look at the downloads, it's really spiked. We work with a lot of our customers on having them try out Apollo Client 3. It has a completely redesigned cache eviction, which if anyone here has used Apollo Client, you've probably been like, I want that forever. And really a lot of just performance enhancements overall. Being able to understand what's going in the cache. There's this new concept called type policies, which is really great. It's an evolution on local state management. And I think it's a very nice pattern that we hope the community will really get behind. So as far as when we're gonna move it to the stable point, that's really gonna be based off of the feedback of the team. Now, we have been getting closer and closer to that point, but there are still some bugs in the cache that are open and outstanding that need to be closed before we can move that forward. So I can't give you like an exact date, but yeah. I'm like looking at Steve and he's like, we don't, yeah. Pretty soon, yeah, it's pretty soon. I mean, the goal was always to have it out by the end of this quarter. And part of, with this big change, so it's gonna be now the @Apollo/client library. So not necessarily gonna be a breaking change. There are some breaking changes inside of the cache APIs and everything. There is a migration docs for anyone else who hasn't seen this. And all of our docs, great thing that Steven added, you can actually switch between the versions of Apollo Client to know where you need to be, which really fantastic. But I think we'll start pushing a little bit more out. You also might have noticed inside of our blog, one of our developer experience members has been putting a lot more blog posts out there, specifically some stuff around Apollo Client. And I shouldn't say what we're working on, but I know we're working on some sample applications around Apollo Client 3 and some updates there that's going to come out in the community soon. And that should coincide right around our launch. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for letting me come out and talk. And, oh, one more question.
One more. I just wanted to give major props for the documentation, and also go back to that life cycle graph. I know that I actually was using the life cycle methods while they were still in documentation in a PR. So I'm super happy to see this all online, and especially the diagram. I wanted to give major props.
Yeah, Steven's diagram. I love it. Great. Well, I'll be sticking around all night. So if you have any questions or anything or want to just chat, I'll be around. Thank you so much.